Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. The Minnesota Council of Nonprofit American Rescue Plan Act, Funding and Potential Opportunities for Nonprofits. So before we get started with the content of the webinar, I'm going to turn it over to Kari to just talk about some of the logistics for participating in today's webinar.
Thanks, Anne. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am Kari Anised. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Associate Director of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, and we're so thrilled to have you today. So today's webinar obviously is hosted in Zoom, and this session is being recorded. The slides and the recording are going to be sent out to you within the next week. So if you miss something, don't worry, we will have a record of it. We're going to be using the chat today and the Q&A tab. So we're going to be asking a couple questions of you and encouraging you all to kind of respond to each other. So to make sure you know how to find the chat, I invite you to look for that now and take the opportunity to introduce yourself to folks who are here. And so while you're doing that, the Q&A tab will also be just kind of to the left of the chat. So if you have a question for any of our speakers at any point, feel free to put them in that Q&A, and we're going to be watching that and making sure your questions get answered. And with that, it's my honor to welcome and introduce Ann Kilzer to this virtual stage. Ann is our main project lead with MCN, who's overseeing this work to track the investment of American Rescue Plan Act dollars throughout the state and working to increase access for nonprofit organizations to those dollars. So Ann is currently a partner at Capitol Hill Associates, and prior to her work at CHA, Ann has held a number of roles in the public sector, most recently with Hennepin County, where she has some experience with grants and contracting. And Ann also holds a master's in public administration with a very heavy emphasis on nonprofit management from Hamline University. It's been so wonderful working with Ann on this project, and I'm just thrilled that I get to turn it over to her.
Yep. Thanks so much, Kari, for those kind words. I appreciate it. So if we want to advance this slide, we have an agenda here to give kind of people a roadmap for what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. We're going to talk a bit about MCN's work in this space, and then we'll give an overview of ARPA funding, its intended uses, and how it's being used here in our state. We're going to be joined by three guests representing local units of government in Minnesota. So we have Lisa Sova from the League of Minnesota Cities. We have Steve Fensky from the Minnesota Association Townships and Jill Surmeyer from the Association of Minnesota Counties. So we'll be hearing from them in just a bit. As Kari mentioned, there's an opportunity for questions and answers, and then we'll just kind of do a final wrap up. So with that roadmap ahead of you, I'm going to turn it over to Kari to talk a little bit about the work that the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits as it relates to public funding initiatives.
All right, thank you, Ann. So a little bit about MCN and why we're doing this. So MCN, we are Minnesota's nonprofit state association, and in that role, we get to leverage the power of 2,300 nonprofit organizations across the state, all working together toward this vision of a healthy, cooperative, and just society. Nonprofit organizations represent 14% of our state's economy, and we take on some of the most complicated challenges that exist in our society. So because of that, MCN believes that the world needs more of what nonprofits do, and funding is a crucial piece of that equation in making sure that nonprofits' work is made possible. So ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, has posed this unprecedented opportunity for our state to make some really meaningful investments, both in our communities and the nonprofit sector and that infrastructure. So it's with special project funding that we received from the McKnight Foundation, thank you McKnight, that MCN has been working on a couple of things in this space. First, some research on where the ARP dollars are going, which is, and others are going to walk through a couple of key channels today. We've also been working to identify and promote what funding opportunities may be available and that nonprofit organizations are eligible for. We've featured open opportunities through MCN's Grants Alert. So if you aren't currently subscribed, I recommend that you subscribe to Grants Alert, and I'll put a link to the chat on how to do that very shortly. And then we're also going to be working toward advocating for the inclusion of nonprofit organizations in funding opportunities, and then hopefully working to streamline some of those grant application processes. In addition to this work, MCN's Executive Director, Nanoko Sato, was an appointed advisor on the Governor's Council on Economic Expansion, which has sought to inform how our state is going to recover from this pandemic, including the investment of relief dollars that are targeted toward that work. So that council has now concluded phase 1, and the full report of their recommendations is available online. I'll also put a link to that full report for your light bedtime reading. And on the screen, you can see a couple of priorities that Nanoko and others have advocated for as a part of that council, including scaling and funding for nonprofits as a part of the broader solution of the state's recovery. On the next slide is a screenshot of an open survey that we have in the field right now. So in March of 2020, we saw, like many others, that the world was about to change, and we kind of quickly launched a responsive impact survey and reporting series. So our first report and survey were issued in May of 2020, and we are now on our 6th survey. It's out in the field, it's open, it's live. And so these results are still in progress, but one of the questions that we've asked is kind of, what are the top advocacy issues that you all see are most important to your work? So as you can see, the survey is open, it could change, but so far consistently respondents have indicated that state funding for issues or the populations related to their mission is a top priority among respondents. So this is part of our work to keep our finger on the pulse of what issues are mattering to you, how current conditions are impacting your work, and what are the meaningful ways that MCN can respond in support of your charitable mission. So after this webinar, please take a few minutes to complete that survey. You'll help us out, you'll help the field out, and we'll continue to put your feedback to good use. And with that, back to you, Anne.
Great. So on the next slide, Kari mentioned that a part of this project has been putting together a resource page within the MCN website specific to ARPA funding. So in response to this, we have created it. It's under the COVID-19 tab on the website. This page includes a high-level overview of ARPA funding and also features a link to a database that is keeping tabs on and compiling current ARPA-funded grant opportunities that nonprofit organizations are eligible for. And that are posted by various levels of government, including directly from the federal government, as well as through state agencies, counties, and cities. A link to sign up for the Grants Alert email that Kari just mentioned is also included on the webpage. We're going to be sharing today quite a few ways to learn about where and how to track the way ARPA funding is being used, but know that this webpage can kind of serve as a one-stop resource to finding the information that's most relevant to you as nonprofit organizations. On the next slide, before we get to our guest speakers, we just wanted to set the stage a bit as to what the American Rescue Plan Act, often referred to as ARPA or ARP, entails. This was passed by Congress and signed by the President in March of 2021. ARPA is meant to provide ongoing relief to mitigate effects of the pandemic. It was preceded by the CARES Act and the Appropriations Act of 2021. It differs from those initial efforts of pandemic response in that it is intended to be a bit more long-term and more structured than some of those earlier programs were that were kind of more emergency-based. On the next slide, we have a flow chart that indicates how the $8.5 billion flowing into Minnesota has landed. We'll go into further detail on each of these pots of funding: the local fiscal recovery fund, the state fiscal recovery fund, and the federal program funds. On the next slide, you'll note that the previous slide did not show any relief specifically flowing to nonprofit organizations in Minnesota. Nonprofits did not receive money directly under the ARPA Act. However, organizations are eligible to receive relief funding from or to provide services for government entities that did receive the funding. And in many cases, they're also required partners in RFPs that are being let out at the federal level. And again, those will be posted on the MCN website. Now, I know that our upcoming speakers will go into further detail about how funding can be used, but generally speaking, there are 5 allowable uses outlined in the guidance that was issued by the U.S. Department of Treasury, and they're listed on this slide for your reference. Again, guidance for ARPA is more detailed than it was for the initial round of CARES funding and prior relief. So now we're going to talk about the 3 large pots of funding that you saw on the flow chart earlier. The first is federal program specific funding. And on the next slide, you'll see that the $3.505 billion in this category. This is supplemental funding for existing federally authorized programs. So in Minnesota at the state level, local elected officials did not get to determine how this funding was distributed among the programs once it arrived to our state. On the next slide, you'll see that the federal program specific funding is being tracked by Minnesota Management and Budget. They've categorized the federal program specific funding into 3 subcategories. They are supporting working families, ensuring students catch up on learning, and supporting small business during the economic recovery. Opportunities to partner with this funding would be limited to organizations who have experience in or the capacity to deliver services under these programs. As you look through the following lists, you may want to take note of programs with which you may have familiarity or prior experience. So on this slide, we have the programs that fall under the category of supporting working families. On the next slide is a listing of the programs that fall under the category of ensuring students catch up on learning. And on the next slide are the programs categorized as supporting small business and driving economic recovery. And again, you'll see the link on the slide there that would take you right to the MMB website where these programs are listed. Outside of this program specific ARPA funding, MMB notes that Minnesota has also received resources to advance public health during the pandemic. And on the next slide, you can see the purposes listed for that funding. Okay, so we're going to move on, and I'm going to pause to talk a minute about where you can learn more about where and how these resources are being allocated. Minnesota Management and Budget anticipated a desire from the public to know how ARPA and other relief funding is being utilized in Minnesota. They created a tool called the Minnesota COVID-19 Checkbook. This is an interactive tool that allows you to see the budgets not only for ARPA funding, but also CARES funding and relief efforts being funded by the Minnesota government. There's also a tab that allows users to drill down into payments by each state agency to each individual entity receiving funding. By way of further assistance, the Minnesota Budget Project, which is a partner of MCN, has a great guide to this resource that includes plain language information on how to access and use the checkbook. And the screenshot there is their webpage that includes that information. On the next slide is a screenshot of the federal program specific funding that has been allocated to Minnesota. So if you click on the blue links within this webpage, if you choose to visit it, it will take you to more detailed information for each of the state agencies that have received funding. On the next slide, we'll show you, based on this information through MMB, we can see what has been spent, obligated, and what remains of the total $8 million in funding from Minnesota. And this $8 billion, encapsulates resources beyond ARPA funding. So using the checkbook, you can dig down into specific programs and organizational recipients of all the funding being distributed across the state. And you can see that of all the funding that's come into Minnesota, about 30% has not yet been spent or obligated for this pot of funding. The next pot of money that we'll talk about is the State Fiscal Recovery Fund. Minnesota received $2.8 billion in this category. It has been slated to be used for 2 purposes. As explained on the MMB website, the governor and the legislature agreed to allocate $500 million for addressing immediate COVID-19 response needs. This was done right when the funding hit Minnesota 2 years ago. Expenditures exceeding $2.5 million are subject to the Legislative COVID-19 Response Commission review process, which is outlined in legislation that was passed in 2021. Monthly expenditure reports and checkbook level spending information is available on the websites listed on the next slide. During the 2022 legislative session, Minnesota lawmakers voted to dedicate the entirety of the remaining funds, $2.3 billion, to replenish and repay the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. The governor signed the bill prior to the adjournment of the 2022 legislative session. The fact that the legislature and the governor dedicated such a large majority of the state fiscal relief funding to one specific purpose does limit the opportunities this funding could have supported for other programs or partnerships with individual organizations. On the next slide, we'll see that it's worth noting of the $500 million for immediate COVID response, There have been 77 projects that have been funded. Each one is described on the Fiscal Recovery Fund request forms that are posted on the MMB website. The Minnesota Budget Project has done an analysis on the immediate COVID response spending as well. This chart, along with additional information, can be found on their website. And so this chart shows you by category how the funding has been spent. And on the next slide is a screenshot of the MMB checkbook, which is another place to find how the funding is being spent by state agency. So those are a lot of resources to see how the funding has been spent, but most importantly, I think for your perspective, is finally on the next chart is a pie chart that shows what has been spent and what has been obligated. Note that of the remaining 11% of the funding that has not yet been spent, the vast majority, $230 million, is earmarked for a final payment to the UI Trust Fund. It's fair to say, therefore, that for the most part, state fiscal relief funding has been budgeted and almost fully spent. So moving on, it may feel disheartening to hear that despite the fact that ARPA funding is available for expenditure for several years, much of it is already spoken for when it comes to the federal specific funds and the state fiscal recovery fund. However, we still have one category of funding left to cover, and that is the local fiscal recovery fund. Minnesota's local units of government, counties, cities, and townships have received $2.1 billion in ARPA funding as well. It should be noted that this does not include funding that was allocated from the federal level to tribal governments. On the next slide, you'll see that the most recent data available on the expenditure rate of this funding shows a much greater percentage still remaining unspent as compared to the other funding pots of funding that we reviewed earlier. This data is of 12/31, and I apologize, that's a typo. It should be as of 12/31/21. Most recently, local units of government had to submit reports to the U.S. Department of Treasury in April of 2022, and that those reports are not yet uploaded on the U.S. Treasury website. So this shows the spending, again, as of 12/31/2021. So if we move to the next slide, with us to describe how the local units of government are utilizing these funds and how we might find opportunities are Lisa Sova, Steve Fensky, and Jill Surmeyer. And each of them will give an overview from their perspective of how their members are thinking about and utilizing this funding. And we're going to ask Lisa to go first, please.
Thank you, Anne. So I'm going to start with a brief overview. The American Rescue Plan state and local fiscal recovery funds provided eligible state, local, territorial, and tribal governments with a substantial infusion of resources to meet pandemic response needs and rebuild stronger, more equitable economies as the country recovered. First, it's important to share that there are 854 cities in Minnesota. 21 are considered metropolitan cities under the American Rescue Plan Act. And generally, these are cities that have populations that exceed 50,000. This group received their ARPA funds directly from the Treasury. The remaining 831 cities with populations under 50,000 are known as non-entitlement units or NEUs. This group accessed funds through Minnesota Management and Budget and had until October 11th of 2021 to request the funds. 744 cities submitted requests for ARPA. NEUs in Minnesota received $105.81 per capita based on the city's 2019 census data, and an additional $3.47 per capita, which represented the redistribution of unclaimed funds. So those cities that did not request funds, that money remained with MMB, and then they distributed that among the cities that had requested. So that brought the total that the cities received to $109.28 per capita, half of which was distributed in 2021, and the balance was distributed about 2 or 3 weeks ago in 2022. As Anne indicated earlier, recipients may use these funds to support public health expenditures, address the negative economic impacts caused by the public health emergency, replace lost public sector revenue, provide premium pay for essential workers, or invest in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. Within these categories, recipients have broad flexibility to decide how to best use the funding to meet the needs of their communities. Eligible expenses need to be incurred between March 3rd of 2021 and December 31st of 2024, with an extension to December 31st of 2026 for projects that are already in process. Examples of ineligible expenses include offsetting a tax cut, deposits to pension funds, bolstering rainy day reserves, and debt service payments. It is the recipient's responsibility to ensure that all ARPA funds are used in compliance with these requirements. Any funds not expended in accordance with the guidelines or obligated within the allowable timelines must be returned. On January 6th of 2022, the Treasury released the final rule, which included an option to elect the standard allowance under the revenue replacement category of expenditures. Under this option, the Treasury presumed that up to $10 million in revenue had been lost due to the public health emergency, and recipients are permitted to use that amount not to exceed their total award to fund government services. The standard allowance offers a simple, convenient way to determine revenue loss, particularly for American Rescue Plan Act's smallest recipients. Government services generally include any service traditionally provided by a government, unless Treasury has stated otherwise. So here are some common examples, although this is not an exhaustive list. Road building and maintenance and other infrastructure, general government administration, staff and administrative facilities, environmental remediation, provisions of police, fire, and other public safety, and that includes purchasing fire trucks or police vehicles. Non-entitlement cities filed their first reports with Treasury by April 30th of 2022. This included the NEU agreement and supporting document report, as well as the project and expenditure report, where cities reported funds spent and funds that have been committed. We await further data from this reporting to learn more about how cities are putting their money to use. But based on the inquiries that I've received from cities are interested in using funds for infrastructure projects. This is an area that cities have long sought funding assistance with little relief. Aging water, sewer, and storm drain pipes and road maintenance and replacement are very expensive projects. So the ARPA funding has provided significant relief to cities, allowing them to address these long overdue projects. Additionally, extending broadband access has been a great benefit to cities. The shift to remote work and learning environments increased demand for broadband. This is generally addressed with a collaborative effort between neighboring communities working together with the county to expand internet access. And finally, an option that is very popular with cities is the standard allowance, which, as I said, became available with the final rule. So to address the intersection of cities and nonprofit organizations under ARPA, the League of Minnesota Cities looks to state statute for guidance. Authority is limited to provide grants. However, authority and statute does exist for cities to provide grant funds to food shelves, housing and redevelopment, economic development organizations, prevention of the cruelty to animals, hospitals that serve the city, the Chamber of Commerce, or other nonprofits that provide governmental services. The League of Minnesota Cities typically takes a conservative position to avoid audit issues and potential disqualification of expenditures, which could result in funding being recalled. It's important to remember that statutory cities do not have the power to undertake any decision or action without statutory authority. When looking to partner with your city on a project, keep in mind that cities are limited in their authority to provide grants. So we recommend that you review state statute and include references to that statute that provides the authority when you're proposing an expenditure of city funds along with your funding request. So with that, Anne, I'm going to turn it back to you. I apologize, I have to leave the meeting. I'll pop my contact information in the chat. So if you have any questions, you can email or give me a call. But thank you for allowing me to join you today.
Yes, Lisa, thank you so much for sharing the city's perspective. And just a reminder that the document that is on the MCN website will have current open RFPs from cities. So if people have something that they want to proactively approach a city government with, an idea for funding, you certainly are able to do that with Lisa's advice of knowing what types of projects can be funded by cities, but also know that any proactive RFPs that cities are putting out that we can find will be listed on that document that's linked from the MCN website. So with that, I'd like to turn it over over to Steve Fensky from the Minnesota Association of Townships to provide a perspective on how their members are utilizing the funding. Steve?
Hello, can you hear me okay, Ann?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So townships, we're all under the same rules. Okay, so anything you heard about the rules, we all play in that same kind of box. To some extent, the differences are going to be in between cities and counties and townships and what are they authorized to do? Because each of them has powers related to what are their purposes of government. And we all do things a little bit differently. So even though we're playing with the same federal rules, you may have instances where one of those government types could do something that another can't. So it will depend on what you ask and where you ask it. As far as the money that got to townships, what we're seeing largely is townships are trying to use that for update to roads. Transportation is the big thing. If for those who don't know a township government, I explain them as the places between the cities. You probably don't know they're there. Okay, they do their powers and their activities are related to serving rural interests. If you're on a dirt road or a gravel road, you're probably on a township. Okay, and so that's a big piece of what they do. And that standard allowance that you heard about earlier, they're using a lot of that money to just try and fix the basic infrastructure that they're there to provide. But some of them still have their money, and their second tranche of money, I think, is out now. And some are looking for other things to do with it. So for those interested, I think the place to start is, first of all, you have to be providing some kind of service related to the township or the place that it's in. You may have to leave your location, your area in some cases, okay? And that's because of something called the public purpose doctrine. It's the idea that whatever a government does, it has to somehow relate to their existence, their public purpose. It provides a general benefit to the people that they serve. So if you're in the Twin Cities, you're probably not going to get money from the Bemidji area to do something down in the Twin Cities, okay? Just because it doesn't tend to serve a public interest in that area. Keep that in mind, okay? As far as who to approach within a township, the folks you want to talk to are the township board. They're the equivalent of the city council or the county commissioners. Those are the folks who make spending decisions. Nonprofits have a history with townships in what's called the annual meeting. Some nonprofits attend the annual meeting of the township, which is a town hall style gathering of the people in that township. It's the second Tuesday of every March. It's Township Day in Minnesota. You may not know that either, okay? But it's where people gather and they have a discussion, and there's powers that are given to them by the legislature that they can switch on and off. And some of them are related to nonprofits. Some of them are switching on the power for that local township board to go do something. Okay, so health, welfare, social services. If you're a provider of that and you can provide it in their area, you may be able to approach the township board. And I'd urge you to approach them at the board meeting, not the annual meeting. Okay, go before March, well before, so people have a chance to learn what it is you do. And they may want to know about how you work, your structure, where your money goes, and then have some comfort in what they're going to propose to their voters about, hey, we'd like you to give money, allow us to do this project with this partner. And then the voters can be asked to switch that power on for somebody. Okay. So again, talk to the township board, the board of supervisors. Okay. Usually 3 to 5 people on that group. If you can, it helps for you to find the statute. And that's hard for folks. I know that's not normal for people to look for, but in government, they don't have any authority inherently. At local government, everything they do has to come from a statute somewhere. And this is largely the same here with this federal money. Okay, so they have to find a reason that says we can do this thing. We put out on our webpage, it's designed for town officers, but it's not behind a wall or anything. We have a resource on finance and contributions, and some of them, some of the statutes that the township could use to work with a nonprofit are within that document. Okay, so think about the place, go to the township board, and if you can, show them why this is legally okay for them to do that. Okay, with that, I think, and that's going to be open to you, whether it's ARPA money or township money. Okay, that's in general, that's not just for this program. So again, townships using that money for transportation largely, or sometimes it's updates. One that I think folks could use out there is digital literacy, if you will. Okay, learning how to use technology. That's a concern in a lot of our townships. They don't have internet, or they've just gotten it and people are trying to learn how to do it. If you're a service provider of that, a lot of them are buying equipment and trying to learn how to use it, how to make their operations more effective. That's the kind of stuff they can contract with. And that does not necessarily take a special statute, because that's just them learning how to run an office, learning how to run an operation. And that can be kind of inherent in their ability to operate as a board, as a township. So I think I'll leave it there for now, Anne. And then if you have questions, I'll answer as I can.
Great. Thank you, Steve, for providing that and giving some specific examples of the types of things that townships might be looking to partner on. I think, hearing specific examples might spur some creative thinking on folks' part as well. So thank you for that. Next, we have Jill Surmeyer from the Association of Minnesota Counties. Jill, what advice do you have for folks about working with counties in regard to ARPA funding and maybe other opportunities that might be on the horizon?
Great, thanks, Anne. Yeah, so we did a survey this spring of our county administrators. Those are the CEOs, county officials, just to find out where they are at in planning their ARPA spending. And we had a pretty good response rate. I think it was about 80% of counties responded. So I'm going to tell you the results of that survey, and I'll give you an idea of where counties are at with spending and planning their spending, and also what they're using their funds for currently. So to start off, about 40% of counties are either still gathering information, or they have like a preliminary sketch of what they're going to use funds for. So that means that there's a lot of opportunities to work with counties, because they're looking for ideas, or they might have an idea of what they want to do, but they need help with execution of it. Another 40% have a plan outlined with portions of the plan implemented, which once again is another opportunity to get involved. And 20% have a finalized plan, and they're already getting close to fully implementing that plan. I'd say that that between CARES, the additional state funding program, and now with ARPA, that our county leaders are really hitting decision fatigue. And so if you have an idea of how to use this funding, that, as Steve and Lisa pointed out, falls within the parameters of what counties can do, please approach your county commissioner about it, or a county staff that's related to that program area. They're looking for ideas and looking for ways to best invest in their communities. And so they would welcome input from you. So looking at some of the spending areas that counties are hoping to invest their ARPA dollars. And I should say that Anne mentioned earlier about how counties, or it was Lisa who mentioned that cities were using the lost revenue option. And that's something that we've seen in a lot of counties. Most counties have decided to claim lost revenue with their funding. And then that means that they have the ability to spend it in a streamlined fashion, rather than having to do a little bit more detailed reporting. So it gives a lot more option for counties on how to spend that funding. And it also means that when you're looking at information about ARPA, it might not be a line item of ARPA revenue. It might be listed as something else, because now it's considered just general government services funding. So when it comes to how counties are spending their money, the majority of counties are expending some funds on infrastructure and capital projects. A lot of these we see as like improvements to county facilities like HVAC systems and air filtration, to improve the public health of the employees. And it's directly tied to, COVID remediation. We're seeing a lot of funding in broadband and public health. We asked specifically in public health, what counties are wanting to do. And, it's things like reimbursing vaccine clinics, and maybe PPE for staff. But there's also a lot of counties that are looking to engage with communities that had a disproportionate effect of COVID, and looking for community outreach opportunities in the realm of public health. So that's a great opportunity for nonprofits to get involved. About 40% of counties surveyed said that they are putting money into behavioral mental health services and housing programs. specifically within housing. It's not just new builds or affordable builds, but it's also rental mortgage assistance and rehabilitation projects. So helping with weatherization of homes, or rehabbing homes that need to be more livable. So that's, once again, another great opportunity to partner with counties for nonprofits. There's also a cohort of counties that are investing their ARPA dollars into expanding childcare in their communities or addressing workforce needs in their communities. So you'll see that counties are partnering with technical colleges to do scholarships or help with paying for books and courses, or tuition for students to fill some of those high need areas of employment that are missing, especially in greater Minnesota. Childcare shortage, you are all familiar with that issue. It's a statewide issue. So we're seeing counties that are investing directly in providing childcare facilities or training for childcare workers. So those are some of the general areas that counties are spending their funds. We asked them specifically if they are looking for opportunities to partner with nonprofits and if they're going to be providing direct nonprofit assistance. We saw with CARES that counties were giving out grants specifically to businesses and nonprofits. So there's fewer counties that are doing direct assistance to nonprofits. Only about 15% of counties are going to do grants. And 30% of counties were uncertain. So that's 45% of counties may provide grants to nonprofits. But what they are hoping to do is partner with nonprofits on programming. So at least 50% of counties said that they were hoping to or interested in doing partnerships with nonprofits when it came to ARPA spending. So it's really a good opportunity for you all. If you are going to approach your county commissioners or your county staff about doing projects, just make sure that it follows the intent of the ARPA law. Even if counties have kind of transitioned the funds through the lost revenue option, they still are planning to use the funds as they were intended by the federal legislation. A lot of counties are also looking for opportunities to do one-time big investments rather than doing programming that will have ongoing tails to it. Since this is a short-term funding option. And as Ann mentioned, there are a couple other new opportunities to partner with counties from federal and state funds that I'm just going to throw in there, that they're not ARPA related, but they should be on your radar. One of these is the homeless grant program that was passed last session in 2020, and it provides $20 million annually to counties to go towards homelessness programming. And counties definitely are looking for opportunities to partner with nonprofits in that realm. The money going to each county might not be a lot, but it's an ongoing program. So it's an opportunity to build a relationship with your county. The second area of new funding is the national opioid settlement, which you may have heard about. Counties and cities signed on to that in this last year in January. The funds will be coming available at the end of this month. There's also a few other national settlements that will be coming through to add to that funding stream. Once again, it's not a lot of money per county, but it is funding that will go on for a while. The opioid settlement funding will go for 18 years. So if you have ideas about how to help with opioid or substance use disorder remediation or family services or anything related to that area, counties are looking for partners in that as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions about any of the programs, but especially ARPA, since we're here to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jill, for all that information. That's really helpful. Jill had mentioned that the Association of Minnesota's Counties surveyed the counties and asked a specific question around whether they plan to partner with nonprofits. On the ARPA website, under the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits page that we were talking about earlier, if you link on the ARPA funding opportunities and click on the county tab, we actually have the results of that survey, and you can see which counties answered yes to that they were planning to provide funding or opportunities in partnership with nonprofits. So if you go to that spreadsheet and see a yes in the column by a county that's in your typical service delivery area, that would be a great place to start to see. And that's not to say, as Jill said, that there might not be opportunities in other counties as well who may still be looking to identify how they're going to utilize their funds. But for those who have said yes, it's a great opportunity. And we really appreciate AMC including that question in their survey. So with that, that concludes our 3 panelists. Just curious to pause and see if folks have questions for Jill or Steve or for Kari or myself prior to kind of wrapping up our webinar for today. Jill, if you see in the chat, it looks like there's a question about looking for opioid settlement funding and grant opportunities or more information about that.
Yeah, so if you want more information about how much funding your county is receiving, you can go to the Minnesota AG's website, the Attorney General's website. On that website, there should be a page that shows how much each county is receiving. Note that that total is over 18 years. So it'll say something, you know, like Candioi County is getting $2 million, but when you break it down, it'll actually be like $20,000 annually. There isn't really information yet on how to apply to grants for that settlement funding because it's up to each county to decide how they're going to use it. So I would say that keep your eye on, you know, what your county board agendas, see if it's coming up, and feel free to reach out to your county staff or commissioners if you have ideas on how that funding could be used, because they're always looking for input and partnership opportunities.
We had another question come through the Q&A, which just a friendly reminder, you can use that also to submit questions for speakers today. Steve, we heard from you that the second Tuesday of every March is annual meeting day at Township Day. That's
Township
so cool.
Day, yeah.
Are there other best times of year that folks should be thinking about contacting either township officials or county officials? Like when might that best moment be?
Well, I can speak to townships. It's each township, and there's 1,780 of them. Okay, so they're all different. They're all their own local government. So most of them will have a monthly meeting, and a person could call and try to get into that monthly meeting. Remember, these are very small in a lot of cases. You may be at somebody's kitchen table for this township meeting. Okay, so you can always call somebody on the township board and have a kind of preliminary conversation and get some sense of what that person thinks. How they may be able to accommodate you, whether there's any money left, and what they may need in the township. As far as so time of month, you can ask when their board meeting is, but then as far as time of year, if they do need voter approval for something, which again, some statutes say the voters have to switch a power on, and now the board can go use that power too. Okay, if you're in that situation, I would start probably January, okay, no later than January, because the town board's going to start to put together a budget that they're going to propose to their voters in that March meeting, and they're going to have a financial discussion in March. So you probably want to get in a little bit earlier as opposed to day of, and nobody knows what to make of it yet.
And I'll answer the question on behalf of counties. County boards meet twice a month in most cases. And it really is unique to each county how they decide to do public comment. So some counties will do public comment at their county board meetings. Some of them will do public comment at their work group meetings or at committee meetings. It's best just to check your county board's website or to reach out to your county commissioner. They have phone numbers, email addresses on the website. So feel free to reach out to them. And even as Steve mentioned, do a preliminary discussion about your thoughts on what you want to propose, or what the county is planning with their ARPA dollars already. In general, county budgets are decided at the beginning of December. However, the budget process starts way in April. That's when departments start collecting ideas on how they want to spend money for the next year and the type of programming they want to do. Those preliminary budgets are presented to the administration of the county, who make kind of final decisions and present it to the board in September. And the board approves like a preliminary budget And then between September and December is when all the details get hashed out. So it's best to approach a county about a big spending opportunity prior to September, and earlier in the year is better. But you definitely want to get it in before the preliminary levy is set in September. And I see that there's another question about homeless grants that I mentioned. That, once again, it's new money, and so counties haven't even received it to start spending yet. So from what we're hearing is that they're having preliminary conversations. Most counties are having preliminary conversations about how they want to use those dollars. So keep an eye on your county board agendas, or feel free to reach out to your county commissioner to ask where they're at in that process.
There's another question that came through. In which areas or community needs are the other future settlement funds that you had referenced?
Those are all opioid settlements. So they'll all pertain to trying to mitigate the consequences of substance use disorders regarding opiates specifically.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions come through the chat. But just, yeah, to echo and underscore what Ann said on that, that beautiful Excel spreadsheet that she's been valiantly tracking and updating will contain information on any open opportunities that come through on this state agency level, county, cities and townships, and beyond. So keep an eye on that. And what great perspective to kind of proactively be able to lift up what statutes allow and empower cities, counties, and townships to fund nonprofits. Never have thought about that in my entire life. So thank you for that hot tip.
Yes, I'd like to echo Kari's thanks to our speakers for joining us today and for the partnership and helping us research this and uncover information and provide transparency to the way that the funds are being used so that nonprofit organizations can understand that. I just wanted to point out that in the chat, there is a link to the grants alert sign up so that any funding opportunities that do come out, as Kari mentioned, will be noticed there. The report from the Minnesota Governor's Council on Economic Expansion is linked in the chat. The impact survey that Kari would love for you to fill out and her colleagues at MCN to understand how they can best serve you. There's a link to today's PowerPoint and also to the ARPA funding opportunity spreadsheet. So before you log off, if you're interested in any of those resources, be sure to click on those links. But otherwise, we'll say thank you so much for joining us today. If you have additional questions, my contact information as well as Kari's is in the PowerPoint that will be available on the website and also send out via email to folks who registered for today's webinar. So, and it looks like Shannon also just put our email addresses in the chat as well. So thank you so much for joining us. If we can be of further assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out, and hope everybody enjoys the rest of this beautiful Minnesota day. Thank you so much.